I'm joined in Washington now by Andrew Tabler from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's lived in Syria and is the author of In the Lion's Den, an eyewitness account of Washington's battle with Assad's Syria. Andrew Tabler, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Now, the Arab League summit has approved a resolution calling for an end to the Syrian regime's crackdown on dissent and for serious national dialogue between all the parties. Are we any closer to that today than we were a year ago?
Absolutely not. Whether it's through the Arab League process or the UN process that you mentioned, we are not close to that. President Assad has not agreed, or he is not sticking to his agreement thus far to pull back troop formations from cities and to bring about a ceasefire. Instead, he's making more demands, and this is pretty common in this process, and something like this in the diplomatic realm has been going on for the better part of a year.
Now, China and Russia have asked the international community not to take sides in Syria, ostensibly on the grounds that the rebels are behaving as badly as the regime and that sovereignty should be respected at all costs. Now, it seems Beijing and Moscow have won the argument, at least at the UN level.
Well, certainly they got the agreement of a presidential statement backing up the Annan plan that commits all parties to this process without an end goal, and that is President Assad stepping aside. But along with legitimacy comes the Syrian regime's obligation to protect its own citizens, and that is not trumped by legitimacy. And thus far, it is the Syrian regime which is driving this process, which has killed many more people the last year, certainly than the rebels, who have really come out in force only over the last 2 months.
Now, given that the UN process has stalled, what happens next?
Well, the UN process can just grind on, but I think what's going to happen is that you'll see more and more demands from each side. Assad has a problem. He's used brutal force on the opposition, and as a result, the opposition is basically headless and scattered. So even if he wanted to make a deal or had to, on the opposition side, it's unclear with whom he could make such a deal that could bring about an end to those kind of hostilities. And then because of that, President Assad continues to make other demands. So now he demands outside the UN framework that the rebels also have to stop first, which is out of sequence with the agreement, and that everyone who has pledged to arm the rebels in the Arab world has to commit to stopping to doing that as well. And that's just simply more demands that are going to make this process even slower.
So what will it take to stop both sides, or at least for the regime to have some genuine commitment to putting down its arms?
Well, I think in the end it depends on what creates necessity with the Assad regime to actually change. I mean, what's driving this in Syria is you have a regime on one side, which is a minority regime like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which with a 42-year track record of not being able to reform, absolutely. One of the worst, if not the worst, in the Middle East. On the other side, you have an opposition carved out of the youngest population in the Middle East outside the Palestinian territories. How do these two things mix is beyond me. It really, the last year has shown that the Assad regime's security solution combined with the opposition's resilience indicates to me that we're nowhere close to getting out of this crisis anytime soon.
Now, you just mentioned there that it was a very young resistance movement, and you've before called it the Hummer effect of demographics in Syria. Just explain that for us.
In 1982, in February of that year, the Assad regime, Bashar al-Assad's father Hafez, carried out one of the worst massacres in the history of the Middle East. Up to 30,000 people were killed in Hama by government forces who used artillery fire on their third largest city. In the 10 years after that, Syrians more or less stayed home. It was very restrictive. The economy contracted naturally. And during of course, what do men and women do when they stay home by themselves? They have a lot of children. And so in the 10 years following that massacre, Syria was among the 10 fastest growing populations on the planet. And it's all those young people born during that time that are now swarming the regime. It's one of the best examples of authoritarian karma that exists.
Now, you lived in Syria for nearly a decade, and in that time you actually worked for one of Asmar al-Assad's charities. Asma al-Assad, of course, is the British-born wife of the president. Now, she was long considered Syria's best hope in the pursuit of democratic reforms in Syria. Did you meet her?
I did on a number of occasions. We had a number of conversations specifically about this. Unfortunately, Mrs. Assad had two natures. One was the original educated person who came into the country and wanted to, I think, do good things. And I think that she did in the beginning. But then there's the other Mrs. Assad over time who just seemed to go along with the regime and I think was ultimately corrupted by it. And unfortunately, that's been borne out in her decisions to support President Assad. And that's the reason why the European Union sanctioned her a few days ago in an unprecedented move.
Because, of course, she's been madly buying up on the internet, we learn. Designer clothing and furniture and all sorts of things. People are quite aghast that she would be thinking of such matters while so many of the people of her country are suffering.
It's not just her country. Her family's originally from Homs. It was her city that was being shelled for a month by regime rocket fire. She's also a Sunni from Homs. Sunnis are the majority in Syria. And she married Bashar, who's an Alawite, which is one of the largest minorities in the country. So it has particular resonance inside of Syria. And politically, it is just very hard for people to believe.
Now, if we take it that Syria needs the international community more than the international community needs Syria, how do you explain the Assad regime's resilience?
I think that what we're looking at here is that in terms of it holding on, so to speak, it's because these minority regimes, like Saddam Hussein's regime, they're galvanized against the kind of splits where you have, like in Egypt and Tunisia, where in a crisis the military comes in and ousts the ruling family. And that gives it particular strength. But it also is its greatest weakness. I think what you're going to look at Syria going forward is a regime that is nominally in charge of Syria, but just not in charge of all of its territory. We've already seen that in Idlib governorate, Homs and Deraa, where the government is not in control of those areas. And instead we have protesters and combined with armed elements who essentially rule in those parts of the country. And I think that's what we're going to see in Syria going forward.
And now you're on your way to Turkey. You're going there for a Friends of Syria meeting. What will you be doing there, and what's the hope for that meeting?
The meeting is designed to set up a coalition of countries to support the Syrian opposition and the Syrian people. And Turkey has been out in front on that in a very commendable effort. So we'll have representatives from all the different Western governments, EU, regional governments, along with the Syrian opposition, which is organizing in Turkey. And there are going to be a lot of discussions about the next steps forward. And the one thing that everyone seems to agree on is that everyone needs to do much, much more with the opposition actually on the ground in Syria, and not just those who are in exile. Is
there appetite in Washington to become more involved in supporting the rebel movement?
I think that there's an appetite for, there's a realization that, especially the veto at the UN by China and Russia, really signaled to us that we really needed to work this from the ground up. But does that mean dumping a bunch of weapons onto Syria? No, it certainly doesn't. It means supporting the opposition on the ground, especially those who are using civil resistance, protests, boycotts, and so on. Those have had the big gains over the last year, and Washington is looking at those movements much more closely, and I think they are going to support that. President Obama mentioned after a meeting with Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey that the United States will begin providing non-lethal assistance to the opposition within Syria, and that's a shift in policy.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.